Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video I am going to demonstrate some of the extended capabilities that you can use with the action when a HTTP request is received. I'm going to use this to send an invoice to a customer, get paid, and be able to communicate with that customer or allow the customer to communicate with a supplier. So let me start by showing you these two SharePoint lists, one called invoice header and one called invoice lines, both of which are currently empty. So I'm just going to run a flow that will populate that and send me an email. So I'm going to show you what this does in its entirety first, and then we'll go over how it works. So now that that flow is running, I've just received an invoice, an email. And here is the email that I've received. So Power Automate has sent me an email with my invoice details, but there is no invoice attached. I have to click to view the invoice. Before I view the invoice, let's just go back to that SharePoint list. So here's the record that has been created, the invoice header, and the lines are here. Now, notice that I have assigned a GUID to the invoice, which will become relevant in a moment. And then there are three more columns: viewed, paid, and PayPal ID. And we'll come back to those in a moment, but these are all Boolean fields. So if I come back to the email and click on the link to view the invoice, this will take me to a flow, a HTTPS flow, that generates the invoice on the fly. Now, the reason that this is useful in the first instance is that the HTML to text actions, the HTML to PDF and the Word to PDF actions in Power Automate are limited. The HTML to PDF doesn't render as you might like, and the Word connector is really good, but does have some limitations. And of course, neither of those methods allow us to interact with the end user. So now that I've clicked on this link, if I go back here now to this list, we can see that this is now marked as viewed. And we'll go over the flow and how that works in a moment. But as I said, this whole page is being generated by a flow at the moment the browser gets to it. So I've got a couple of options here. I can print the invoice, and this will take just this area here. The buttons will be ignored. So I click print invoice, and then I get a nice printable document, or I can save it as a PDF, and it will take the title from the page and allow me to save it as that. So that's printing. One of the other functions we can do is enable the customer to communicate back to us. Okay, so they can then send that query in, and it just says, thank you, your query has been received. And then in Teams, I've got another flow which receives that query and tells the team member what invoice it was on, the message from the customer, and a link back to the invoice. So both useful functions, being able to print and enable the customer to send a one-way message back in. And then you get to this pay invoice option. So if I click on this, this will open up this payment area and enable us to go in and pay that invoice. So if I log in with my Sandbox account and choose to have that paid, okay, so now it just comes up, thank you for your payment, and the PayPal part is all done. So this is really enabling us to be able to collect money is what you want with an invoice, And this PayPal integration, it's not really easy, but it's not very difficult at all, and you can build it quite quickly. And I've also done this with Stripe in a production environment. So if we now go back to here, if PayPal have been in touch yet, it might take a few seconds. What's going to happen is PayPal will acknowledge the payment that's taken place, and they are going to send a HTTP request back into Flow to let Flow know that the invoice matching this GUID has been paid. And there we can see it has now been paid, and the PayPal ID is there. So if I go into my PayPal sandbox, okay, so in my PayPal sandbox, I can see the webhooks that have been executed. And here is the event that just happened as a result of me paying that invoice. And that's now complete. And you just configure PayPal with the HTTPS address of your Flow, which receives that data. I think we can have a little more detail in here as well. Yeah. So here you can see the reference ID that PayPal sent to Power Automate should be the GUID 3FA it ends in, and there it is 3FA, and that is how Power Automate updates the record. So let's go and have a look at how this is all put together. So actually, I forgot one thing. If I go back to here and now refresh this page, the option to pay has now been removed because it has been paid, and it is marked as paid underneath. So let's now go back to the Flow. So the first thing is when a HTTP request is received, and we can see the method is get because we'll be receiving a browser interface, and then we've got the GUID and the customer ID. So if we go back to here, you can see the GUID was embedded in the link and the customer ID. And so when we are in our Flow, we can use that to reduce the number of results back from SharePoint, ideally just to 1. Here I've got my PayPal client ID, and then I've initialized a variable called HTML response, and this is going to be what is sent back to the client. So then I'm going to get the header details from the invoice. If we go show advanced options, we can see GUID equal to GUID from the trigger action, and the customer code equal to the customer ID from the trigger action. So get header is only going to return 1 result. Then there is a condition, and that is if the length of the outputs from this get header is equal to 1, then we go on. Otherwise, it sends some static HTML back to say that this invoice isn't found. So if I change this GUID, take off the A on the end, it will just come up document not found. So let's continue on the yes side. So then we go into a get lines action, which is where we pull out all the lines of the invoice. Then there is a select action. Now, when you're doing a flow like this that returns data back to a browser interface, you cannot include any action before the response that has slow performance. So for example, this select action is used to build up table rows for this part that shows all of the lines from the order. If we were to use an apply to each here, this flow would take so long to execute that the browser would time out or the user would give up. So you can't use any apply to each actions or anything that takes a very long time. So this select action builds these TRs. In fact, if we have a look at the run history, that would be a nicer place to see it. Now obviously when you're building something like this, you do need to have a little bit of experience in HTML. And so here you can see an array of table rows and table cells being generated from the output of get lines, which is just a get items from SharePoint action. And then these are just joined in the next action with a carriage return. So let's go back and edit that, and then we can see that working. So the lines are just joined with this decode URI component %0a, and that is just a carriage return. So that gives us our nice table data, but it does it fast. Now, I'm not really good at HTML, and for this whole HTML invoice, I didn't really write any HTML. I just went into Google and typed HTML invoice template, picked the first one, which is this, and here is the demo, and as you can see, that HTML invoice looks almost the same as that, except I added a few extra fields. So, getting back to the flow, and that is actually a nice, this is worth just talking about this again very quickly, because there are hundreds, thousands of HTML templates which you could buy from the internet or find for free that you can use for all kinds of document delivery. So that's just worth bearing in mind, and somebody else has already done a lot of the work for you. So after that line data is joined, then I set this variable HTML response. Now, as you can see, this is quite a long piece of HTML, and it has got Power Automate expressions built into it. So what I like to do is I prefer to have this inside of Notepad++ and then work with it in here. Now, as you can see, I've got the invoice title is the outputs from the get header action, and getting the title column, which is the invoice number. Now, you probably don't want to write your Power Automate expressions in Notepad++, because it's not so easy to do either. So what I like to do is just add a compose action. I'll do it down here. And I could put the output of join line data, for example. And then I just copy that, go back to Notepad, and then just paste it in wherever I want that value to appear. And then it's much easier to work with in Notepad++ or any other text editor, because it just gets very difficult to do inside the Power Automate editor. So here we've got our HTML styling, and then we get down to some script, which you can see here. This does the print, shows the payment window, renders the PayPal buttons. And clearly, if you don't have much experience with JavaScript, then these parts will be quite challenging to do. There are lots of code samples on the internet which you can use, but the advantage here is that you get to leverage the full power of the libraries and JavaScript engine available inside of browsers typically. So as you can see, all the way through the document, there are just Power Automate expressions adding more and more detail to build the complete document. So then the variable is set, as we've seen, and then we go into a response action. We need to set the content type to text HTML, otherwise the browser will just render it as plain text, and the body is just the HTML response variable. Now, once we've responded, we can then go into any actions we like and take our time doing whatever we want. So if you want to put an apply to each after the response, or some other action that takes a long time, then that's absolutely fine. The key thing is that response back to the browser client needs to happen pretty quickly. Let's just see how long it did take. Yeah, I mean, we're 2 seconds in this main section, which is quite acceptable, and we can see how long it takes here. If I press refresh now, it's appeared. So it is about 2 seconds. So that is that flow done. And a couple of the other features that we were looking at. Customer invoice query. This one is dead simple. There's really not a lot to this one. When a HTTP request is received, and this one just sends the response straight away. It just responds straight away with the status code 200 to say, you know, successful, and responds back message received. It then does the stuff that takes the time, does a get items with an OData query on it. I'm not even sure what this does. Oh yeah, creates the link to the item, and then we post an adaptive card to Teams. Clearly this action could be an email or anything else that you felt appropriate. I used an adaptive card. So that's super simple. And this will be this is actually a post method. It's not filled in, but that is a post because that's a jQuery post to that. And let's go and have a quick look at the source for that, which will be yeah, we can see it here. So it gets the value of the query. It also gets the invoice value, the invoice number, and then the query, the data that gets sent into Flow is the customer query and the invoice ID. So this little bit of JSON here, and then it does an AJAX request to the URL of the flow that receives that data. So there really isn't a lot of code to it, but if you haven't used JavaScript, then that could be quite tricky. So now let's go and have a look at the final part, which is this PayPal integration. Again, this is not complicated because there's not a lot going on here. Sorry, wrong flow. This one is the one I meant. So this is simply when a HTTP request is received. This compose does nothing, it's just left over. It gets the items from the invoice header list where the GUID is equal to the trigger body, which is coming in from PayPal. And that will be the GUID for the invoice. And then it just updates the PayPal ID and the paid flag. So the PayPal ID comes from PayPal as well. And then the paid flag is set to true. And that is what then sets these two fields. This update text field action probably looks a little bit unfamiliar because there are no fields here. That is just a small trick that I use sometimes. I'll show you how that works. And you don't have to use this trick. You can see if I pick the same list, then it will give me all these fields to look at and insist on certain things. It's actually not too bad in this list. But if I just put in a manual custom value here and then put an expression in string and then the name, it doesn't ask me for all of that information. It just expects a piece of JSON with the field names in it. And then I can just pass any value I want. I prefer that method, but both methods are equally valid. And so that sort of brings me to the end of this demonstration. I hope that it does demonstrate the power of this action. When a HTTP request is received, you can use it to send data to browsers and receive data from browsers. And normally when we think of this action, we think of API actions that we could execute, which is typically what it is used for. But we can use Power Automate as a web server by using this method. One of the things that I do want to quickly point out is that this page loaded a number of external resources. jQuery, for example, the PayPal API, JavaScript, this logo, and they were all loaded from external sources. So if we go and have a look at the source of the HTML, so the style sheet loaded from my blog, another style sheet loaded from my blog, and then the jQuery was loaded from Cloudflare, and then finally PayPal would have loaded directly from PayPal somewhere. Here we go. Here's the PayPal JavaScript library loading. So we really only need one flow to get all of this to the browser client, because the browser can load resources from anywhere. So if we went into my developer tools and then went to sources, here you can see the different resources being loaded from different web servers. So hopefully this will inspire you to think about all the other things you could do with that when a HTTP request is received action, because it really is super powerful, and I've done quite a bit of playing with it. And there are certain documents also that are useful for a moment in time, and as they age become less useful. So a good example would be customer statements. You could provide a link for your customers to be able to view their statements and show all of their outstanding invoices, and then click into an invoice, see the invoice, and then choose to pay it. So applications like that are a really good use for this tool. So I hope you enjoyed that video and learned something new, or at least expanded the possibilities of what you thought was possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers, bye-bye. Hello everyone, welcome back. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I am going to demonstrate to you the capabilities of the HTTP